It happened during dinner. Just a regular Thursday night roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the sound of cutlery clinking against porcelain. Ashley was talking about redecorating the living room when she paused, looked me straight in the eyes, and said I should start looking for another place to live. At first, I thought I misheard. Maybe she meant something else. But then she added so casually, it chilled me that it was time Jason and she had their own space, that I'd been living here long enough, and it was starting to feel crowded. I turned to my son, hoping, expecting he would speak up. Say it was ridiculous. Tell her I had every right to be here. But he didn't look at me. He just kept cutting his food slowly, like he hadn't heard a thing. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. I opened my mouth, then closed it, not knowing what to say. I'd raised that boy alone after his father left. I worked nights and weekends, gave up everything to make sure he never lacked anything. And now I was being treated like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. No, not a guest. A burden. A nuisance. Sense. Someone they wanted out of sight. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just sat there tasting nothing while Ashley chatted on about paint samples and curtains. Jason stayed quiet the whole time. That silence told me more than any words could. Jason was just 6 years old when his father walked out. One morning he was there, and that night he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a note and a suitcase full of empty promises. I remember folding that note and slipping it into the trash, not because it didn't hurt, but because I didn't have time to fall apart. There were bills to pay, a child to raise, and no one else to count on. I took a job cleaning classrooms at night, then found another at a diner on weekday mornings. Sleep came in pieces, meals were skipped, and birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes and thrift store gifts. But Jason never knew how tight things were. I kept our little world warm and full, even when the world outside felt cold and mean. He was everything to me. Every extra hour I worked was for his lunch money, his soccer cleats, his chance to feel normal. I remember sitting in the bleachers at his school games, still in my work apron, pretending I wasn't dead tired. He'd look up at me from the field and wave, and I'd wave back like I wasn't running on 3 hours of sleep and burnt coffee. I just wanted him to feel seen. When he got into college, I cried alone in the car. Not because he was leaving, but because somehow I'd managed to get him there. I took out a small loan to cover the difference after his scholarships ran short. Never told him. That was mine to carry. Years later, when he brought Ashley home for the first time, I was thrilled. She was smart, polished, said all the right things. I thought maybe now he'll have the family I couldn't give him before. They got married in a small ceremony, and I stood in the back with my hands clasped, feeling a mix of pride and something I couldn't name. At first, things seemed fine. We still had dinner once a week, and Jason would call just to say hi. But slowly, those calls grew shorter. The dinners became rare. Then one day, Ashley suggested I move in to be closer. I thought it was kindness. Now I see it was convenience. Or maybe guilt. Either way, the warmth started to slip away little by little. The house got quieter. The hugs got shorter. The space between us grew, but I kept telling myself it was just life, just busyness. I didn't see the wall going up until it was already too high to climb. At first, I tried not to notice the way conversations ended when I walked into a room. I'd bring in a tray of tea or fold a blanket on the couch, and suddenly their voices would drop. If I asked a question or added a comment, it usually hung in the air for a few seconds before being ignored. There were dinners where I sat quietly at the end of the table, smiling through stories I wasn't invited to join. Jason would laugh with Ashley about a new show or something from work, and I'd nod along even though I hadn't been part of the joke. I started to feel like furniture, useful only when they needed something done. One afternoon, Ashley had a friend over. They were in the kitchen talking while I cleaned up some dishes. I heard her say low, but not low enough. She's just always here, like she's floating around waiting to be noticed. Her friend laughed. I didn't move. I just rinsed another plate and dried my hands slowly. After that, I stopped trying to talk during meals. I stayed in my room more. When I did come out, I made sure not to get in the way. I tiptoed around like a guest, even though my name was on the deed they. Ashley brought it up like she was offering me a favor. She said her cousin was visiting for a few weeks and needed the guest room, and wouldn't it be more peaceful for me to move downstairs anyway? I nodded, not trusting my voice, and the next day my things were already stacked by the basement door. The space was small, cold, and smelled faintly of damp concrete. A narrow bed had been pushed against the wall under a tiny window that let in barely any light. There was no closet, just a metal rack with hangers, and no room for the books I used to keep beside me at night. They told me I could use the space however I wanted, but the truth was I didn't have any say. The thermostat was upstairs, and when the house got cold, I stayed cold. When it rained, the water tapped against the glass, like a reminder that I was no longer part of the main world above. I sat on that bed the first night looking around at the storage boxes they hadn't even bothered to move. Holiday decorations, old furniture, a box labeled "Garage Sale Maybe." That was where I live now. Among things they didn't need, but hadn't yet thrown away. There was a time I paid for Jason's private music lessons with tips from the diner. I remember skipping my own lunch so he could have new sneakers for gym class. Now I was in a basement, like a forgotten object tucked away so I wouldn't take up space. And I realized for the first time that maybe they didn't see me as family anymore. Maybe they hadn't for a long time. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the air feels a little too quiet. I had made pot roast the way Jason liked it when he was younger, slow-cooked all day with carrots and potatoes. We sat around the table, Ashley scrolling on her phone between bites, Jason barely saying a word. I asked how work was if they'd had a chance to visit the new bookstore downtown. Jason mumbled something without looking up. Ashley didn't answer at all. The silence felt heavier than usual, like something was building beneath it. Then Ashley put her fork down. The sound of it hitting the plate was sharper than it should have been. She looked straight at me and said they'd been talking and they thought it was time for me to consider other living arrangements. Her voice was calm, practiced, like she had gone over this in her head many times. At first I thought it was a joke. I laughed just a little, waiting for the punchline. But there was nothing in her face. No warmth. Just impatience. She said it again, slower this time, as if I hadn't understood. I turned to Jason. He didn't look at me. He stared at his plate, pushing a piece of meat around like he was trying to disappear into it. My heart felt like it dropped out of my chest. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. After everything I had done, after all the nights spent worrying about his fevers, all the birthdays I worked double shifts so he'd have a cake. After giving up every piece of comfort so he could have a better life. I was being discarded like a coat no one needed anymore. I asked why not angrily, just quietly. Ashley said they needed space, that I was interfering with their routines, that newlyweds should have privacy. She smiled like she was offering me logic, like she was being reasonable. Jason still hadn't spoken. I wanted him to look at me, to say something, anything, to defend me, to stand up for me. But he just sat there. I stood up slowly, holding the back of the chair to steady myself. My legs felt numb. My hands were shaking. I remember thinking that I needed to finish cleaning the dishes, that the floor looked dusty near the fridge. My mind grabbed anything to keep from breaking. I said I understood. Not because I did, but because I couldn't bear to hear more. I walked downstairs that night without touching my dinner. The food I had cooked sat untouched on the stove. No one followed. In the basement, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. There were no tears, just a stillness so loud it filled the room. That was the night something broke in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a small thread snapping deep inside one that had held me together longer than I realized. The house was mine. I bought it 15 years ago after my husband passed and the insurance money came through. It wasn't a mansion, just a modest 3-bedroom with a porch that got good morning light, but it was the first thing I ever truly owned. I never told Jason. He assumed I was just staying with them. Ashley probably thought the house came from Jason's savings or some family arrangement. But my name was on every document, every tax bill, every mortgage payment I made, and finished without their help. I didn't speak up because I wanted them to feel at home. I thought if they believed it was theirs, they'd settle in and build something solid. I thought love meant stepping back, giving space, staying silent. But love doesn't mean vanishing. And silence isn't the same as surrender. I had been the one who kept the lights on, even when I couldn't afford new shoes. I had signed every paper at the lawyer's office and paid every bill. The deed sat folded in the back of my drawer, untouched, waiting for a day I hoped would never come. Now that it had, I wasn't angry. I was clear. I knew what I had to do. Not to hurt them, but to remind myself that I still had a voice. And I still had choices. The next morning, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the small window in the basement. The house was quiet. Jason had already left for work and Ashley was upstairs on a call. I reached for my old address book, flipped to the page with the realtor's number, and dialed. Her name was Dana. We'd met years ago at a church fundraiser. I told her I was ready to sell. No rush, but I wanted to move forward. She didn't ask many questions. Just scheduled a time to come by and take photos. Over the next 2 weeks, I packed up what little I still called mine. A few framed pictures, my mother's dishes, a small wooden box of keepsakes I hadn't opened in years. I didn't say a word to Jason or Ashley. They thought I was sulking. In truth, I was clearing space for myself. I searched online for a 1-bedroom near the park where I used to take Jason on Saturdays. Found one with a sunlit balcony and quiet neighbors. It wasn't large, but it felt like enough. Enough for me. Enough to start over. By the end of the 3rd week, Dana had an offer. I accepted without hesitation. The papers were signed in a small office downtown where no one knew me as anyone's mother or burden. Just as a woman selling her house. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, like I'd come up for air after holding my breath for too long. And for the first time in years, the air felt like mine. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was the official notice from the new owner's attorney giving Jason and Ashley 30 days to vacate the house. I had already been gone for 2 weeks by then. I didn't need to see their faces to imagine the confusion. I pictured Ashley holding the paper with her jaw tight, her voice rising as she asked Jason what this meant. Jason called me that evening. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail asking if there was some mistake, that they got a letter about the house. His voice cracked a little at the end like he was trying not to sound afraid. I waited a day before calling him back. We met at a cafe near my new apartment. He looked thin or tired in a way I hadn't seen before. When he asked why I didn't tell him, I just looked at him and said it wasn't my place to explain things he never asked about. He kept talking, trying to find the right words, but nothing landed. Ashley wasn't there. She had sent a few frantic texts that I didn't answer. I think she finally realized that I was never just a shadow in her home. I was the owner of the ground she walked on, and she had never seen it. Jason asked if I did this to punish them. I said no. I told him I didn't need revenge. I didn't want them to suffer. I just needed peace and space. The same space they once asked of me. He sat quietly for a while. Then he asked if I hated him. I told him I could never hate him, that he was my son and I would always love him. But love doesn't mean I have to stay where I'm not respected. I stood up, ready to leave. He looked up at me with eyes that finally seemed to understand. I leaned in and said softly, I never asked for much. Just a little respect. I walked away without looking back. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing else left to say. The past had closed, and I wasn't carrying it anymore. My mornings are quiet now. I wake up when the light spills gently through my curtains, not from footsteps overhead or voices in the hallway. I make coffee just the way I like it, sit on the little balcony with my blanket, and listen to birds I used to be too tired to notice. I take walks in the park without looking at the time. Sometimes I stop by the library or sit by the fountain and watch people pass by. No one needs anything from me, and that used to scare me. Now it feels like freedom. There are still days when a memory catches me off guard. A photo, a song, the smell of roast chicken. I let it come. I don't push it away. But I don't let it define me anymore. I've learned that peace doesn't come from being needed. It comes from choosing yourself even when no one else will. I spent a long time pouring out everything I had, and now I'm learning what it feels like to be full. This new life isn't fancy. It's not dramatic or loud, but it's mine. Every piece of it. And I wouldn't trade it for anything I left behind. I'm not bitter. I'm free. And that's more than I ever thought I'd feel again. If you're a mother like me, I want you to know you're not alone. Maybe you've given everything you had. Your time, your sleep, your dreams. Maybe you've loved with your whole heart only to feel like you faded into the background. I've been there. I know how heavy that silence can feel. But I also know this. You are more than what others see. More than how you've been treated. You still matter. Not because of what you've done for others, but because of who you are. Your worth doesn't disappear just because someone forgets to say thank you. There is strength in quiet grace. In choosing to stand even when no one notices. In walking away without slamming the door. You don't have to shout to reclaim your voice. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave the room with your head held high. You are not invisible. Not to me. Not to those who understand this kind of ache. We carry each other by telling the truth even when it hurts, and by reminding one another that our stories don't end in someone else's shadow. So if you feel overlooked, pushed aside, or forgotten, hear this. You deserve joy. You deserve rest. You deserve to live in a space where love feels safe and respect is not something you have to beg for. Keep going. You're not bitter. You're just beginning again.